It is Monday, May 11th, 2026, and the world woke up this morning to the wreckage of what was supposed to be the most important diplomatic day in the Iran war since the ceasefire began. 33 days into a fragile, imperfect, repeatedly violated truce that both sides claimed was still technically in effect, Iran handed a document to Pakistani intermediaries in Islamabad, a formal response, weeks in the making, described by Tehran's own foreign ministry as realistic and positive, carrying what Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi called a clear choice for Washington: diplomacy or the continuation of a confrontational approach. The document traveled from Iranian hands to Pakistani hands to American hands. It reached the Oval Office. President Donald Trump read it. And 2 hours later, not 2 days, not 2 weeks, not after a measured interagency review, not after a National Security Council session, not after Secretary of State Rubio could construct a diplomatic response that kept the channel alive, 2 hours after the document arrived, Trump posted twice on Truth Social. First post: Iran has been playing games with the United States and the rest of the world for 47 years. They will be laughing no longer. Second post: I have just read the response from Iran's so-called representatives. I don't like it. Totally unacceptable. That was it. No details, no specific objection named, no counterproposal, no path forward outlined. Just capital letters and a rejection so fast and so total that it landed on Monday morning like a grenade thrown into the one room where the people trying to stop this war were still talking. And as the world processes what those two Truth Social posts actually mean for the ceasefire, for the nuclear negotiations, for the Strait of Hormuz, for Trump's imminent trip to Beijing on May 14th to meet Xi Jinping, for the 1,500 commercial ships and 20,000 crew members still trapped in the Persian Gulf, and for the 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that Netanyahu told CBS's 60 Minutes on Sunday night is still sitting in Iran and must be physically removed before the war can be considered over. This is the full story of what happened, what it means, and where this goes next. Stay until the end, because the most important part is not the rejection. The most important part is what was in that document, what Trump was actually reacting to, and what is left of the diplomatic architecture now that he has publicly blown a hole through it. To understand the weight of this moment, the morning of May 11th, 2026, and the wreckage of Sunday's exchange, you need to understand the full architecture of the negotiation that produced it. Because this was not a sudden crisis. This was the predictable result of 72 days of fighting, negotiating, fighting while negotiating, and proposing and counter-proposing across a relay channel that runs through Islamabad and depends entirely on both sides maintaining the fiction that the ceasefire still means something. Go back to February 28th, when Operation Epic Fury began. 900 strikes in 12 hours. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei killed in the opening hours alongside his family. Iran's conventional navy largely destroyed on day one. 120 Iranian air defense systems destroyed or disabled. The Strait of Hormuz closed 6 days later, removing 10 million barrels per day from global oil markets, the largest supply disruption since the 1970s energy crisis. Brent crude surging past $120 per barrel, a global economy already under strain now absorbing an energy shock of historic proportions. And then the deadlines. March 6th, Trump demanded unconditional surrender and threatened to strike Iranian energy infrastructure and bridges. Deadline of March 21st set, passed. March 23rd, passed. April 7th, passed. And then on April 8th, 40 days into the war, 3 missed deadlines later, Pakistan delivered what Trump's ultimatums could not. A conditional 2-week ceasefire, brokered by Pakistan's military chief general Asim Munir, whose unique position as a trusted interlocutor for both Washington and Tehran made him the only human being on Earth capable of threading that particular needle at that particular moment. Trump extended the ceasefire indefinitely on April 21st, and around that ceasefire the proposal architecture began to build. March 25th, the United States sent Iran a 15-point proposal demanding the dismantling of nuclear facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo, a permanent commitment to never develop nuclear weapons, handover of all enriched uranium to the IAEA, full IAEA monitoring, and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran rejected it entirely. April 7th, Iran sent its own 10-point plan. Trump called it a workable basis, then said it was not good enough. May 3rd, Iran upgraded to a 14-point plan, demanding a peace deal concluded within 30 days, security guarantees against future military action, withdrawal of U.S. forces from areas surrounding Iran, lifting of the naval blockade, release of frozen Iranian assets, war reparations, removal of all sanctions, and an end to fighting across all fronts, including Lebanon. It did not include specific provisions on the nuclear program. Washington received it, reviewed it, and sent back its own 14-point counterproposal, demanding a uranium enrichment moratorium of at minimum 12 years, the transfer of Iran's 440-kilogram stockpile of 60% enriched uranium out of the country, full IAEA verification, and the gradual reopening of the strait during a 30-day negotiation window in exchange for sanctions relief and the unfreezing of Iranian assets. That American 14-point document sat in Iranian hands for a week. And on Sunday morning, May 10th, Iran's answer came back through Pakistan. And by Sunday evening, it was totally unacceptable in capital letters on Truth Social. And on the morning of May 11th, the world was trying to figure out what that means. Here is what Iran actually proposed, not what Trump reacted to in caps lock, not what Iranian state media characterized as realistic and positive in the diplomatic vocabulary of a government that needed to frame its own document in the most favorable possible light. What the document actually contained, assembled from the most granular sourcing available. Al Jazeera's Islamabad correspondent Kamal Haider, Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency, the state-run Islamic Republic news agency, Global Security's documentation of Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghei's televised statement, and the Wall Street Journal's reporting on a specific nuclear concession that Tehran immediately disputed. According to Tasnim, the Iranian proposal stressed the lifting of U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctions on Iranian oil sales during a 30-day period, and the ending of the naval blockade as the essential prerequisites to any further negotiation. It demanded an end to the war on all fronts, explicitly including Lebanon and the ongoing Israel-Hezbollah conflict. As a condition for any deal, a demand that the United States and Israel had separately insisted was not part of the Iran negotiating framework, since the Lebanon ceasefire was a distinct U.S. State Department-mediated arrangement. It demanded what the National described as security guarantees against future military action, formal, binding commitments that the United States would not attack Iran again, which Iran wanted guaranteed by third-party powers, including China, Pakistan, Russia, and Turkey. It demanded Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, a framing of maritime rights that directly contradicts the American position that international shipping lanes are governed by international law, not Iranian permission. It demanded war reparations from the United States for damage done to Iranian civilian and military infrastructure during the 72-day conflict. And on the nuclear issue, the single point that Trump himself said at the April 11th Islamabad talks was the only point that really mattered, describing Iran as unyielding on the nuclear question. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Baghei stated explicitly in his televised remarks that the 14-point plan contains absolutely no details regarding the country's nuclear issues. Zero. The document Iran sent through Pakistan on Sunday addressed ending the war. It did not address the nuclear program, and the Wall Street Journal reported, citing sources, that Iran had offered to transfer some of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium to a third country, but had rejected the idea of dismantling its nuclear facilities. Iran disputed that report through Tasnim, but the journal's reporting was specific enough and sourced well enough that even the denial confirmed the basic shape of Iran's position. Transfer some uranium, keep the facilities, preserve the right to enrich. That is not zero enrichment. That is not the moratorium on enrichment that Washington is demanding. That is not the dismantling of Natanz and Fordo that Netanyahu told CBS it must include before the war can be considered over. That is Iran offering to move some of the chess pieces while keeping the board. Now let's talk about what Trump was reacting to in those two Truth Social posts, because the speed and totality of the rejection tells you something important about the internal American position that the diplomatic language of the negotiation has been obscuring. The American position, when you strip away the negotiating framework and read what Trump himself has been saying in the intervals between diplomatic statements, is actually much closer to Netanyahu's 60 Minutes formulation than to the 14-point proposal framework suggests. Netanyahu, in his CBS interview previewed Sunday, was categorical. The war is not over, because there is still nuclear material, enriched uranium, that has to be taken out of Iran. There are still enrichment sites that have to be dismantled. You go in and you take it out. Netanyahu said Trump had told him directly, "I want to go in there." That is the language of physical extraction, not negotiated transfer, not a moratorium, not a 12-year freeze, not a temporary suspension monitored by the IAEA. Going in and taking it out. And Trump, in a separate interview with independent journalist Cheryl Atkinson, described the American surveillance posture with the kind of confidence that is either a deterrence message or a genuine operational capability. We have that very well surveilled. If anybody got near the place, we will know about it and will blow them up. Space Force, Trump added, is watching Iran's enriched uranium facilities. They are watching that. If somebody walked in, they can tell you his name, his address, the number of his badge. That is Trump describing not a diplomatic arrangement with Iran, but a unilateral American monitoring operation conducted by military surveillance assets against Iranian nuclear storage sites without Iranian consent, which is the opposite of a negotiated agreement in which both parties acknowledge the terms. The gap between those two postures, an Iran that says its nuclear program is not even on the table in the current document, and an American president who says he has the storage sites under Space Force surveillance and will blow up anyone who approaches them, is not a gap that Pakistani intermediaries can bridge with diplomatic language. It is a gap between two fundamentally incompatible definitions of what this negotiation is for. The nuclear arithmetic underneath all of this is the part that makes Sunday's diplomatic wreckage genuinely dangerous rather than merely frustrating. Netanyahu, in multiple interviews this weekend, CBS 60 Minutes, Fox News, confirmed what Reuters had reported in its exclusive 3 weeks earlier, citing 3 sources familiar with classified intelligence assessments. The time Iran would need to build a nuclear weapon has not changed since before the war. Iran holds 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. Wyon's reporting cited Netanyahu directly. We certainly know where it is. We have a pretty good idea of where it is. Netanyahu acknowledged in an I-24 News interview what Netanyahu himself had said the U.S. knew going into the strikes. The B-2 bomber missions targeting Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan were not designed to destroy the enriched uranium stockpile. They knew they wouldn't get it. The strike was intended to target Iran's capacity to enrich more uranium or to weaponize it. The stockpile, the 440 kilograms that represents enough feedstock for approximately 10 nuclear weapons, if further enriched, was always going to survive because it is stored in locations specifically designed to survive the most powerful conventional munitions the United States possesses. A 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the bunker buster carried by B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, and used in the June 2025 Operation Midnight Hammer strikes on Fordo, is the most powerful non-nuclear bomb in the American inventory. And the IAEA Director General told the Associated Press last month that the majority of Iran's highly enriched uranium is likely at the Isfahan nuclear complex. Trump has that complex under Space Force surveillance. Netanyahu says Israel knows where it is. Russia's Vladimir Putin said Saturday, in a statement that arrived with its own geopolitical complexity, that Moscow's proposal to take Iran's enriched uranium to Russia to help negotiate a settlement remains on the table, an offer that would move the stockpile out of Iran, but also give Russia physical custody of the world's most strategically sensitive concentration of near-weapons-grade uranium. The material is known, the location is estimated, and it has survived Operation Epic Fury, survived Operation Midnight Hammer, survived 900 strikes in 12 hours, survived the entire 2-month campaign. And now it is the central object of a negotiation in which Iran says it is not on the table in the current document, and America says it is the only point that really mattered. The Pakistan dimension of this crisis goes deeper than the relay function of the ceasefire channel because Pakistan is not a neutral party in this drama. It is a country with its own existential stakes. Pakistan shares a 909-kilometer border with Iran. The Hormuz closure has been devastating to Pakistani energy imports. Al Jazeera's Kamal Haider reported from Islamabad that fuel prices are sky-high in Pakistan as a direct result of the Strait blockade and the insurance market's refusal to cover Persian Gulf transits. Pakistan imports significant volumes of LNG and petroleum through routes dependent on the Persian Gulf. The Pakistani economy was already under severe IMF-monitored fiscal strain before February 28th. The energy shock of the Strait closure has made that strain dramatically worse. General Asim Munir has a personal stake in this negotiation succeeding that goes beyond diplomatic prestige. He has a country that cannot sustain indefinitely the economic consequences of a war being fought 900 kilometers from its western border. And yet Pakistan's position as mediator has now been structurally complicated by Sunday's exchange. When Trump publishes totally unacceptable in capital letters on Truth Social within 2 hours of receiving a document delivered through your diplomatic channel, you have not been given the courtesy of a quiet back-channel response that allows you to go back to both parties and begin constructing a path around the objections. You have been handed a public statement that Iran is playing games, that their response was unacceptable, and that they will be laughing no longer. A statement that Iranian state media had on its front page before Pakistani diplomats could pick up the phone. Iran's negotiating team responded through Tasnim with the kind of defiant detachment that signals they had anticipated this outcome. No one in Iran is writing a plan to please Trump, the Tasnim source said. When Trump isn't happy, it is usually better. That is not the language of a side that feels chastened by the rejection. That is the language of a side that expects to use the rejection as evidence, for domestic consumption and for international audiences, that Washington is not a serious negotiating partner, that the entire framework of U.S.-Iran talks is a performance, not a process. Into this collapsing diplomatic moment arrives the most inconvenient possible scheduling commitment: Trump's trip to Beijing on May 14th. The summit with Xi Jinping that was originally scheduled for March and postponed because of the Iranian war is now proceeding in 3 days in the middle of a diplomatic crisis created by Sunday's Truth Social posts, at a moment when every analyst from CSIS to the Council on Foreign Relations to Time magazine is trying to calculate whether the trip can still happen and what it can possibly produce if it does. A senior Trump administration official briefed reporters Sunday that Trump could apply pressure to China on Iran in areas such as oil sales and Tehran's purchase of potential dual-use military civilian goods. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had accused China of funding the largest state sponsor of terrorism by purchasing 90% of Iran's oil exports. CSIS's analysis noted that the recent Beijing visit by Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi shows China positioning itself as having already weighed in with Iran to reopen the strait, suggesting Beijing is trying to claim credit for whatever pressure it has applied without formally endorsing the American negotiating position. The Council on Foreign Relations was blunt about the power dynamic. At the Trump-Xi summit, China will have the upper hand, not because China is militarily superior or diplomatically more sophisticated, but because China has built buffers against the energy shock that the U.S. has not. China's gigantic strategic reserves, its diversified overland pipeline infrastructure, its electrification program reducing oil dependence, and its role as the world's dominant supplier of the capital goods needed to build out non-fossil electricity infrastructure have left Beijing in a position to watch the Hormuz crisis with strategic patience that no U.S. ally can match. Time magazine's analysis put it with particular clarity. Despite half of China's oil and almost a third of its LNG imports transiting the strait, Beijing has weathered the disruption surprisingly well, and Xi can feel rightly smug. Trump is flying to Beijing in 3 days carrying a rejected Iranian proposal and totally unacceptable Truth Social post as his latest diplomatic statement, and the request that Xi lean on Iran to accept a deal that Iran just publicly called an American wish list. Xi's leverage on Iran, as the buyer of 90% of Tehran's oil exports, as the provider of the HQ-9B air defense systems and Beidou satellite navigation that rebuilt Iran's military capacity after the 2025 strikes, as the Krink Axis anchor whose economic oxygen has kept the Iranian regime from collapsing under sanctions pressure, is real and is significant. Whether Xi will use that leverage in the direction Trump wants is a different question entirely, and every analysis from CFR to CSIS to Time to Red State arrives at the same answer. Probably not in any meaningful way. What does this leave? The ceasefire that was supposed to be holding is technically still alive as of Monday morning, May 11th. The UAE Defense Ministry confirmed on Sunday it had intercepted 2 drones coming from Iran. A bulk carrier ship was struck by an unknown projectile off the Qatari coast. The Iran Revolutionary Guards Corps threatened to target U.S. sites in the Middle East if Iranian tankers came under fire. A threat issued one day after U.S. military forces fired on 2 Iran-flagged oil tankers attempting to dock at Iranian ports in violation of the U.S. blockade. The U.S. military has turned back 61 commercial vessels and disabled 4 since the blockade began on April 13th. CENTCOM confirmed 3 American destroyers transited the Strait of Hormuz under fire on May 7th and took 0 hits, the engagement that produced the F-35 strikes on Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island that we covered in detail in a previous video. And yet through all of it, the drone intercepts, the tanker engagements, the destroyer transit firefight, the port strikes, neither side has announced the formal collapse of the ceasefire. Trump confirmed it Sunday evening on a phone call with ABC News. The ceasefire is going. It's in effect. If there's no ceasefire, you're not going to have to know. You're just going to have to look at one big glow coming out of Iran. He trifled with us today, Trump said of the Iranian attacks on the 3 destroyers. We blew them away. The ceasefire is the container that is holding this situation. It is cracked. It is leaking. The contents are under enormous pressure. And the diplomatic mechanism that was supposed to relieve that pressure, the Pakistani relay channel, the 14-point proposals going back and forth, the Steve Witkoff meetings in Islamabad, just took a direct hit from a 2-hour Truth Social rejection that made private diplomacy publicly impossible. What Pakistan does next, what Iran does with the Tasnim defiance signal it sent Monday morning, what Xi says to Trump in Beijing on May 14th, what happens to the 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that Netanyahu says must come out before the war is over and Trump says is under Space Force surveillance with a promise to blow up anyone who approaches it? These are the variables that will determine whether May 11th, 2026 is remembered as the day the Iran war's diplomatic track survived a crisis or the day it ended. The document came through Pakistan. Trump read it. He exploded in 2 hours, and by the morning of May 11th, everyone in Islamabad, in Tehran, in Jerusalem, in Beijing, and in the West Wing was trying to figure out what comes next, in a war that technically has a ceasefire and practically has nothing left of the diplomacy that was supposed to end it.